Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Am I supposed to start or?
Would you like to first check your slides by sharing it?
Let me see.
Hello, Fozia.
Hi, how are you? Let me share the.
Yeah.
Is this visible?
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah, we have 2 minutes to start the talk. After that, we will start. Yeah.
Okay.
How's the internet there now? Is it okay?
Yes, we have a fiber connection, so it's quite reasonably good.
It's 3:15. Shall we start? Judges?
I'm ready whenever you are.
I think we should start.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Welcome all of you in the second lecture of the afternoon. So we have speaker Professor Fozia Kasi. She is a professor and head of the Department of Mathematics and Mathematical Sciences and director at Islamic University of Science and Technology. She holds a PhD in mathematics from Syracuse University in New York State and worked as an academician in US for many years before returning to the Kashmir in 2009 when she had joined the Islamic University. She was instrumental in starting a job-oriented mathematical programs at Islamic universities and as well as a math outreach program for school children through which the math festival and teacher training programs has been conducted. Her research area uses the mathematics symmetry analysis on shawls, latex, and other traditional patterns of Kashmir to understand the culture order and the interaction in the region. Other than a mathematician, she is also a very good painter and photographer. And most importantly, she try to connect the mathematical element with her art. So we are very lucky to have she as our speaker, and today she is going to talk on the patterns of culture. So Before going to start your talk, I will like to ask a question. So when audience asks a question, would you like to take that in between the talks or at the end of the talk?
If it is something that will hinder their understanding, then they're welcome to ask it during the talk. But if it is something that is more sort of general connected to talk, then at the end is better, because that way. But if somebody doesn't understand something in particular, then that may sort of, as I said, hinder their understanding, then they're more than welcome to ask it during the talk.
Okay, sure. Please, Professor, please continue your talk. Yeah, start your talk. Yeah.
Thank you, Asha. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure being here. I especially enjoy talking to students. These days, we don't get to see them much. But at least this is an opportunity to talk about something that is very close to my heart. I'm a mathematician, as you heard, but I'm also an artist. Asha described me as a very good artist. I don't know about that, but I do like to paint and do photography. So this is something that interests me, and it is something I got interested. This was not my primary field of research, but I got interested in it a few years ago, and it's been quite rewarding. So let me begin. I always like sharing images which are beautiful, which sort of depict the effort and the artistry and the creativity that goes into some of these works of art. We tend to describe, works of art in terms of non-functional art, like a painting, as opposed to something that is more functional, that has a direct use day to day, what we generally classify as craft. But people who engage in these crafts are also artists in their own right. So this is basically one of the shrines here in Kashmir. This is a very old shrine near Pahalgam, if any of you know that area. And a very common form of woodwork, which is what we call lattice work. So basically different pieces of wood that are joined together in a sort of a tongue and groove join to make these window lattices. They're very popular, or were very popular in old days, and now they're becoming even more popular. If you look at the different windows, this is part of the drum of the spire in this particular structure. You can see that there are at least 4 or 5 different designs just of the lattices. The description of these designs will be done mathematically, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But these are patterns that repeat, even though we're in this case seeing only a small portion of the window. But one can imagine that this pattern, any of these, can be extended in all 4 directions to form an infinite pattern, and we can think of it as a pattern on a plane. And a repeated, or what is often called a periodic pattern. Here is another example. This is an old shawl, fragment rather of an old shawl. And again, there is a basic motif which repeats. So again, a repeated pattern on the plane. We can imagine that this can extend up or down or right or left, and can be thought of as a pattern on the plane. This is a ceiling, what is locally known as a khatamband ceiling. Again, pieces of wood of certain shapes which are fitted together in a tongue and groove joint to form these ceilings. So this is called khatamban, another type of pattern. And this is a carpet. So several different materials. It can be wood, it can be fabric, it can be even tiles. All kinds of materials can be used to create these repeating patterns. In this case, it's a pattern on a plane. Sometimes we look at the borders. For example, if you go back to this, I don't know if you can see the cursor. There are certain borders here or even here, which in this case is used as a border pattern, but in some cases can also be extended as a plane pattern. So we'll talk about the border patterns as well as the plane patterns. The left of my screen has this black and white vertical strip that is also can be thought of as a border pattern. We also see patterns in nature, some of them repeated, some of them not. Beehive is a very common sort of example given in mathematics of tiling, what is known as a regular tiling, because it is hexagons approximately, and you can tile the plane with hexagons. But these are some of the other examples from nature where you see the use of symmetry being, or the notion of symmetry being deployed. And we'll talk about symmetry also. The kind of symmetry that's very commonly understood is sort of bilateral symmetry, or the principle of reflection, that the left side is the same as the right side, so to speak. You can see that in the butterfly, for example. Now, here is another repeated pattern. It's an ancient Egyptian pattern. And this was described, it's a beautiful pattern, but it was described by Spicer, who's a group theorist, basically a mathematician. He's described it as a mathematical achievement of the first rank. You wouldn't normally think of a pattern like this being described as a mathematical achievement. But there is a lot of mathematics in it, and for a culture to be able to create a pattern like this is quite remarkable and requires certain techniques and certain understanding of shapes and forms and structures, which has been deployed here also. Another person, Ibn Khaldun, describes carpentry in this particular way by saying that it requires a certain specialized knowledge of proportion, measurement. So he declares that, therefore, the leading Greek geometricians were all master carpenters, because you require certain degree of understanding. And you can also go the other way and say that carpenters are also experts in geometry. Just as a sort of an aside, if you ever watch a carpenter make a table, say if the table is supposed to be a square, they have a very easy way of checking that. What they do is even sort of for a rectangle. So if you want to ensure that the top of the table is a proper rectangle and not a parallelogram, all you have to do is measure the two diagonals. If the two diagonals are the same, then it has to be a rectangle, because for a parallelogram, one diagonal will be longer than the other. So it's a very sort of cool trick, but it requires an understanding of mathematics or geometry. So for most of this talk, we'll focus on the notion of symmetry. As I said earlier, it is often understood to mean mirror symmetry. If you remember the picture of the butterfly that I had put up earlier, that the left half of the butterfly was a mirror image of the right half. If we think of ourselves, for example, when we look at ourselves, usually our left half is a reflection of the right half, more or less. This is common in the animal kingdom also. It allows animals to move this type of symmetry, the bilateral or the mirror symmetry. It allows animals to move in a sort of a straight path. And the earliest use of symmetry, again, it was bilateral symmetry. It's a teardrop-shaped axe or axes, which were made more than 1.5 million years ago. So if you imagine a teardrop, it has bilateral symmetry. The left half and the right half are mirror images of each other. So we will focus on the symmetry of repeated geometrical patterns in the plane having one color. We will ignore color, even if the pattern has more than one color, we'll ignore and we'll just look at the structure of the pattern. Just imagine just black and white lines, or that the pattern is made up of those lines. And the symmetry, and I'll explain this in a minute. Symmetry of such a pattern is the motion of the plane that leaves the pattern invariant. So what does that mean? So here are sort of examples. If I take this, the top left one, for example, I have this paisley motif. And if I take that and shift it, what is known as translation, I'll get the same thing again, but in a different position. This is known as translation. Now imagine I had a sheet of paper with this paisley pattern on it, and I have a sheet of glass over it with the same paisley pattern on top of the original, same two that I have here. If I lift that sheet of glass, if I lift that sheet of glass and shift it, it should, and then put it down, it should match the original pattern. We call that a symmetry. And again, I'll show you with some of the other examples. So this one, if I take this and move it to the right, it's translation. If I take the same paisley pattern and imagine this vertical line as a mirror, I'll get a reflection of it. So this is called a reflection. And then rotation, you have the same pattern, and then you have a fixed point. It could be on the pattern or outside of it, and you rotate it around that a certain, it doesn't have to be, in this case, it's 180 degrees, but it can be any other angle. So it's called rotation. And then the last one is called glide reflection. And the best example of glide reflection is your footsteps. If you're standing and then you start walking, imagine like this paisley here is your right foot and this is your left foot, or you're walking up and down. So glide reflection is basically you start with a reflection and then you shift one of the patterns either up or down. So in this case, if I had reflected the original and then I'm shifting it down, it becomes a glide reflection. These are known as the 4 rigid symmetries or 4 isometries. Isometry in mathematics is a distance preserving map. So we're not shrinking the pattern, the original motif. If you look at it, the size of the original paisley motif remains the same. We're not shrinking it, we're not expanding it, we're simply moving it across either a line or reflecting it or rotating it. or a combination, any of these motions keep the original pattern intact in terms of its size. So if I had taken, say, 1 point over here and 1 point over here, the distance between those 2 points will remain the same, even if I translate it, even if I rotate it, and so on. So there is no expansion or shrinkage. When we do have that, where we expand or shrink, that's a different kind of symmetry. It's called symmetry of scale. We're not going to talk about this one here, but you should sort of be familiar with it. Fractals often have that, that it's a sort of a larger version or a smaller version of the patterns. Snowflakes have that property also. So the idea now is that we'll look at these geometric repeated patterns, which are on a plane. They could be a border pattern, or they could cover the entire plane. And we want to understand these patterns using mathematics or using a mathematical approach. So why should we do that? Why does mathematics allow us to understand these patterns? And why is that understanding any better than any other approach if we had used? The idea is that when you think about the process of creating symmetries, there are certain mathematical tools and certain mathematical classifications which can be used, and they have a universality about it, in the sense that they're not dependent on the material that is used for creating the pattern. They're not dependent on the culture that has created this pattern. They're not dependent on the color. So it allows us to study patterns across several sort of regions and compare them. It allows us to study patterns across several materials, whether it is textile, whether it is wood, whether it is tile, whether it is something else. We can ignore all of that and just focus on the pattern itself and its classification. So it's a uniform measure of comparison. I don't know if there are any math students here? I mean, there is a notion, I've tried to sort of keep it non-technical, but in mathematics, there is a notion called a group, which is basically you have a set and then you give it a certain structure. And one can explain this, this notion of these patterns through something called symmetry groups. And so, for example, the Egyptian pattern you saw can be classified by its symmetry group. And the underlying structure is understood by the way its basic parts are arranged. And I'll show you a picture in a minute. So this is the last point is very important. The classification focuses on how the design elements are arranged and repeated, and not on the nature of the design elements. So what you do is you start with a basic design element. Think of it as like a stamp. You have a basic motif, or often called a fundamental tile. And you take that basic motif and you you arrange it in a certain way, you apply different symmetries, and you create a pattern. Then you can also take the same basic motif and apply a different set of symmetries or arrangements, and you'll create a different pattern, which has a different classification. That's the idea. So here are two examples. Let's start with this one, top left. This pattern here and what I have here on the bottom pattern, but again, the top left one, they look very different, right? Similarly, the bottom one here looks very different from the bottom one here. And I can say the same thing about this one and this one. Even though they look different, if I take this one, say the bottom one here, and the bottom one here, their mathematical structure is the same. Even though the patterns look very different, their mathematical structure, or what we would call the symmetry group, is the same for both of them. Basically, what we're doing is, I can explain it this way. We have this paisley motif, which will be my fundamental tile or the stamp. It has no symmetry of its own. I take that and I reflect it. Once I reflect it, I get this bigger motif. And then I'm translating that bigger motif to the right and to the left, and to the bottom. I'm doing exactly the same thing here. I have this basic motif here, which is the fundamental tile. And then I reflect it to create a bigger sort of tile. And then I'm repeating those tiles by translating them to the right and to the bottom. If I look at this one here, I have the basic paisley motif and I've rotated it 90 degrees around this. And then another 90 degrees, then another 90 degrees to create a bigger tile, so to speak. And I'm doing exactly the same thing here. 4 rotations, but it gives me a different looking pattern because I have used a different starting point or different fundamental tile. So visually the two patterns look different, but the method of creating them is the same. So their symmetry group will be the same. And then obviously the same is the case with the top pattern, top left one. This just uses translations and nothing else. So you're just shifting it. So this is the idea that you can have two visually very different looking patterns that can have the same mathematical structure because we have used the same technique, same transformations to create those patterns. We've just used 2 different starting points or 2 different fundamental tiles, but the process was the same. So their symmetry groups will be the same. Here is another one, an example. This is an old window, again, a lattice work, broken obviously in pieces. If you look at this blue and green pattern, it looks very different from the window pattern. But the symmetry structure is the same, and I'll explain it. If I take this sort of as my fundamental tile, this small right angle triangle, and I've copied it over here in red, then I'm taking that red and I'm rotating it 90 degrees to get the bottom yellow, and then this yellow and this yellow. So 4 rotations. And then each of those right triangles is then reflected along the hypotenuse. And you get this main design. And then you are just repeating that design by translating it. And exactly the same thing is happening here. This part is missing, but if I had that over here, that pattern is then rotated 90 degrees, another 90, another 90. And then you reflect this over here, you reflect this over here, and so on. So again, you have 2 very different looking patterns, which give you the same symmetry structure, which give you the same symmetry group. So both of these patterns belong to the same classification. So when we look at border patterns, people have, or mathematicians have classified these all possible symmetry groups of border patterns. And it turns out that there are only 7 possible groups for frieze patterns. Frieze patterns are border patterns, basically. And for what are known as wallpaper patterns, which are patterns, periodic patterns on the plane, which cover the entire plane, there are only 17 possible structures or 17 possible symmetry groups. And for finite patterns, meaning they don't repeat, there is no translation, there are only two possibilities. So if I go back for a second, like if this, something like this, I'm not repeating anything, I'm just, this is like a pattern. This could be like a finite pattern. While as this is a repeating, it can cover the plane. I can take this and also let it cover the plane. But if I'm not, if I just look at a motif by itself, this is a finite plane. While as, a finite group, while as this repeats over the entire plane. So 7 for freeze patterns, 17 for wallpaper patterns, and 2 if you have a finite group, a finite pattern. So here are examples of the 7 freeze patterns, where again, I've taken the same fundamental tile for the sake of consistency. We're using the same basic motif as the paisley. So in the first case, I want to create border patterns. So I'm only translating or moving in one direction and not up and down, only right and left. So all I've done in the first one is just translated it. So you shift it here, then you shift and you continue to shift, and you get something known as F1. This is the first freeze. Then second, here I've done a glide reflection. These are, if you look at it from the side, it's a regular, footsteps. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right, as if you're walking. So if you are walking on sand, your footprints will be freeze group 2, F2. And then different variations on it. Here I'm reflecting and then translating that group of 2. Here I've first rotated and then translated that couple. And here I've reflected and then glide reflection of the, so here it was glide reflection of a single motif. Here it's glide reflection of the double. After you first reflected it, then you take that pair and you do a glide reflection of that. Similarly, there are, this one is a reflection and then a translation. So this is a reflection and then, so horizontal reflection, then vertical reflection, and then you translate that. And it turns out, so it's basically sort of a combination of reflections, rotations, whichever rotations you can do, with the restriction that you're only moving along one line. So you can do translations only along that line, not up and down translations. So with those restrictions, it turns out that you can only do these 7 types of structures. No matter what you try, anything else, if you want to play with something like this, what else can you try? It will be one of these. If you start with a different fundamental tile or different motif, your patterns will look different, but you will only have these 7 structures. These are the 17 wallpaper groups. I'll just explain it briefly. Here, the fundamental tile is taken as a triangle. So in the first one, all you're doing is just translation in 2 directions, right and bottom or up. So that is the first group. And then different variations on it. For example, here you're rotating and then translating, you're reflecting, here reflection and then translation. There is glide reflection here, there's rotation here, all kinds of things. So double reflections here. So all possibilities are explored and you get 17 different structures. So these are the 17 different symmetry groups that can be formed on a plane. So why only 17? There are restrictions on the type of rotations you can do. And the restrictions are you can only do a 180-degree rotation. This is for the plane. You can do a 120-degree rotation. You can do 90-degree or 60-degree or no rotations. If I go back, like this one, for example, has no rotations. Right? While as this one, if I take this, it has 4 rotations, so 90-degree rotations. This one has 60-degree rotations, so does this one. This has 120-degree rotations. So you can have 120, 180, 90, 60, but nothing else, or 0. So these are the only possibilities. And the proof of this, I mean, it takes a little, maybe 5-10 minutes, but it's not that difficult to see why there can't be any other rotation. For example, why can't you have a 5-fold rotation? And it turns out if you have a 5-fold rotations, then you want the pattern to also repeat and be periodic. But a 5-fold rotation will not allow it to be periodic. There will be some overlap. So it doesn't work. Any other angle just doesn't work. So if you compare now, out of the 17, there are 4 groups which have no rotations. As I illustrated one of them, like the first one has no rotation. It only has translations. I've just numbered them 1, 3, 4, and 5. 2-fold rotations, there are 5 groups. And then 4-fold rotations, there are 3 groups. And 3-fold rotation, 3-fold means 120 degrees. There are 3 groups. And then 6-fold rotations, there are only 2 there, groups 16 and 17. There are, I mean, I'm numbering them, but there are also notations for them, which we don't need to get into. If you look at this, like the 6-fold, what is P6 and P6M, this one and this one these are the only 2 groups which have 6-fold rotations. This is P6, 6 meaning 6-fold, and M is for mirror. Mirror meaning that it allows reflections. You can see there are reflections in the patterns, while as this one doesn't allow reflections. These are the 3 in the group of 120-degree rotations. P3, there are no reflections here, but these 2 admit reflections, but in different ways. And then these are the rest of them, like 2-fold rotations, 1-fold rotation, 4-fold rotation, and so on. So this is sort of the division of the 17 groups into these categories, 5 categories. So now we come to the issue of using the symmetry groups to understand certain cultural preferences. And this is where we will talk about the work of some non-mathematicians also. The first example is Crow and Washburn. Donald Crow was a mathematician who collaborated with Dorothy Washburn. She was an anthropologist. And their collaboration resulted in sort of a better understanding of how the symmetry analysis of patterns can be used to understand cultural preferences. They've done a lot of work. They've published several books. So the theory is that, and there are other people also who have worked on this, but the theory is that a given culture will consistently use only specific symmetries. When I say symmetry, I mean symmetry groups in their design system. So for example, if it is a plane pattern, that means a repeated pattern on the plane, which has 17 possible structures, a particular culture will not necessarily use all 17. Even if they do, they would have a preference for certain structures. So out of these 17, they may over and over use only 5 or 6. And this has been seen across cultures, across different mediums, where the patterns were done, whether it is textile, it's a basket weaving, it's clay, it's pottery, woodwork, any of that. And there are certain sort of key points that arise, which is the sum of it is that there are certain preferences for symmetry groups in a particular culture. And one of the most interesting examples is the Incas. And the researchers who were working on this, they called it the Inca insistence. That Incas there were certain symmetry groups that they preferred. And that manifests itself in how their cities were laid out, how their houses were laid out, their pottery design. All of them show this particular preference for certain symmetry. So out of the 17 groups, they've only used 5 or 6 over and over again. They didn't use all 17, they used, I think, 12. But out of those 12, there are only 5 or 6 which are used most frequently. The others are very rare. And as I said, it is not just restricted to periodic patterns on a plane, whether it is a pottery or basket or something else, but it also manifests itself in how they laid out their cities and so on. This is one of my favorite examples, is in northern sort of California, it was actually Washburn who had studied the basket weaving of the Native Americans. And they've had certain symmetries that they've been using traditionally over and over in their basket patterns. And then the white buyer, the Western white buyer, got interested and wanted to buy the quote unquote traditional baskets. What was observed was that the Native Americans would weave the baskets, but they had one set of symmetries that they kept for themselves, which were the traditional symmetries. But at the same time, they, since the white buyer wanted to get the traditional baskets, they made a different set of baskets, which outwardly looked similar to the traditional ones, but they changed the symmetry group. So there were subtle changes made in the patterns which changed the symmetry group. So a different set of symmetry group baskets for the white buyer and the traditional set of symmetry groups for themselves. So it was a sort of a deliberate attempt on their part. So now if you look at Kashmir, and I have looked at the patterns that are available here from all different materials, whether it's carpets, shawls, as I said, khatamband, which is the ceiling, the window lattices, even copper work, different mediums. All 7 of the frieze groups are present in Kashmiri material culture in one form or another. In fact, even in just the woodwork, if you look at the carved wood or window lattices, you can find all 7. But in terms of the wallpaper groups, which is patterns on a plane, not the border patterns, but patterns that cover the entire plane. So these would be shawls, carpets. window lattices, and so on. Only 14 of the 17 groups are used. Some more frequently than others. The more common ones are groups that have either a 6-fold symmetry or a 4-fold symmetry. Those are relatively common, 6-fold especially. You may see a faint pattern as the sort of the background to this slide in the back. This is a lattice window pattern, very common in Kashmir. It's a very traditional lattice design, and it has a 6-fold symmetry. You can see the 6 of these petals emanating from the center, and then you can see the hexagon, and it's a basically a hexagonal grid. So this is a common pattern. So 6-fold and 4-fold are generally more common. But some of the others have also been used, but only 14, not all 17. So which 3 are missing? What was the most interesting part is that the missing groups all belong to the 3-fold category. 3-fold meaning those that have 120-degree rotation. 60-degree rotation is the most common, but 120-degree rotation is missing completely from the patterns. And the 120-degree, which is a 3-fold, it is present in all the neighboring areas. So here are some examples. Like here, this pattern in the middle, you can see the center, it has the 3 lines, and that tells you it's a 120-degree angle. So this pattern has 3-fold rotation. Similarly here, this one is from Fatehpur Sikri, the middle one. It also has, because of this, it has a 120-degree rotation. This is a 3-fold pattern. This one is from Uzbekistan. This is from Ladakh, similar to this one here at the top left and bottom right. This is from Lama Yuru, the monastery in Ladakh. The walls are painted with these deities, which are supposed to be like the guards. And this particular pattern is supposed to be the armor that they're wearing. And in Tibetan sort of cultures, all these deities which are meant to be guarding a particular monastery, they wear these armors. So it's painted onto them. And here also you have a different armor, but same 120-degree rotation here as well as here, even in the blue. So it's very common. And the last one that I've encircled in red, this is from Jammu, one of the palaces there. So 3-fold patterns are used in all the neighboring areas, but not in Kashmir. You can also see 3-fold patterns being created out of a 6-fold pattern by use of color. Like this is Afghanistan. If you look at it, if I ignore color, this is a 6-fold pattern. It's a hexagonal base, and it has, but if you look at the motif in the center, they've alternated the colors. So it's green and blue, it alternates. And because of that alternating color, it doesn't have a 60-degree rotation anymore, because if I rotate this 60 degrees, the blue will go to the green position. And so I can notice the difference. It only admits a 120-degree rotation. So the blue, for this blue to go over here, you have to give it a 120-degree rotation. Same thing is here. This is an Umayyad pattern, again, alternating colors. You have white and blue. So it becomes a, what would normally have been a 6-fold becomes a 3-fold by use of color. What is interesting is that in Kashmir, even when these 6-fold patterns are painted in some instances, like this is another mosque, it has that six-fold, similar to the background that you see of the slide. Six-fold pattern. They have painted it, but there is no attempt to alternate the colors of the individual motifs. Like here, for example, the Khatamband on the wall. It has a six-fold hexagonal sort of grid. If they had just alternated the colors here, it would have become a three-fold. But again, there's not even that attempt when paint is used. They don't, even then, they don't change the color. So that was the interesting. And so what I'm trying to say is that this is a way, and as we saw with the Incas, as we saw with the Native Americans, this is a way to for a culture to depict its preference. That when we understand cultures, we also try to understand them through the use of the symmetry groups and understand their preferences, or in this case, design preferences. And if you ask any of the artisans, I've had conversations with people who make these patterns, who do even now woodworking and so on. If you ask them, you show them the two patterns, two different structures, they will say things like, this looks better. They don't necessarily, because they don't, obviously they're not mathematicians, they don't know about symmetry groups. So they wouldn't necessarily be able to articulate that this belongs to a different symmetry group. But what they can articulate is that it is not right. That's how they will describe it. It doesn't look good, or it doesn't look right. So it's sort of an inherently processed sort of understanding of what design is good and what design is not good. So I will end with this particular example. This was a piece in the SPSS Museum, which is in Srinagar. I was looking at, they have a very good collection of artifacts, some tiles dating back to 3rd century, the Harvan tiles. I was looking at their textile section, and I came across this particular piece. And I was intrigued by it, and the picture is not very clear, but if you see the full brocade, I saw it and it was not labeled there. I mean, they were digitizing their collection. So I went to the director and I said, because this intrigued me, and I asked him, I said, where is this piece from? And he opened his laptop and he looked at it and he said, it is a Kashmiri piece. And they had the date, they had the number. I mean, each piece had the number on it, and he looked it up and he even had the picture, which is where I got it from. And he said it is Kashmiri. The pattern on this piece is actually a threefold. And by then I had already discovered the absence of threefolds in Kashmir. So I told him, I said, this can't be Kashmiri. You have to check again. He said, no, we have digitized this properly and it is Kashmiri. I said, no, I am pretty sure that this is not Kashmiri. Is there any other source where you can check it again? So he called somebody to his office. They had, when they digitized the collection, their original records were these, thick, dusty old registers. And every item was their history of that item and how and when it was purchased or gifted or whatever was written in those registers. So they looked up an old register and found the original description of this item. And it turns out that this was made in England and then gifted to the Maharaja at that time. And he had brought it, or somebody had brought it from England. And I often give this example So it obviously, I was able to catch the mistake because I was certain that this, because it is a threefold pattern and threefold patterns have not been used in Kashmir, that this could very well not be Kashmiri. And it turned out it was not. So this is a good example that even though visually there's nothing about this pattern that can sort of, there's no red flag in terms of this can't be local. The pattern could be from anywhere. If you look at the shawls or brocades, it's a common sort of style, but the structure is not common. And so using mathematical symmetry, one can, I was at least in this case, able to catch a very serious mistake. I will stop here. And if there are questions, I'll be more than happy to answer.
Thank you, Professor Kwasi. It's a really wonderful talk and interesting one. So now a talk is open to the audience to ask a question. Yes, Joy, please go ahead and ask the question.
Thank you, Professor Kazi, for that very nice, very interesting and informative talk. I really enjoyed it. So you were speaking of the absence of the threefold symmetry. So is there any underlying reason why that has taken root? That it can't be, or is it just spontaneous aesthetics?
I don't think there is a specific reason. It is that it, I think, evolves that a particular culture decides on, certain, what looks right to them. It's a process that probably takes many years. When you talk to the artisans, because that's exactly what I was trying to understand when I was talking to them as to why this particular symmetry is absent, or this particular set of symmetry groups. There was no clear articulation on their part as to why. The only thing they can say is that it doesn't look right, and it is not. Initially, I was thinking perhaps because I started with just the lattice windows. If you can sort of see in the reflection, there is a window pattern behind me. It's actually in front of me, but you can see the reflection. This is a very common, this one is in particular is a fourfold. Very common design. Another one that I show as the background of this is a sixfold. So I was studying the window lattices in the beginning, and I thought maybe it had to do with the material or the method for constructing those, because you're limited, you have to do the tongue and groove joints and so on. But then when I couldn't find a threefold I wanted to say that all 17 groups are found. So when I couldn't find, then I moved on to textiles also, even copper work. They do carving of the copper, they do carving of the wood. It's very easy if one were to try to do this in shawls. All you're doing is embroidery, so you can very easily accomplish it. But it's total absence in any material. So it cannot be because of the techniques that you're using. It can't be the material. It has to be something else. This is where the preference comes in, I think, over what would be regarded as right and not right.
So probably in the collective mentality, it evolved that was not the right thing to do.
Exactly.
Yeah, kind of over a period of time, and then kind of it got entrenched.
Nowadays with all this commercialization of commercially built tiles and so on, you can find threefold tiles on pavements everywhere. Not just. So it's I've seen, for example, I went to my dentist's office and he had etched glass as the partition in the screen, you know, the different cabins. And the glass had a 3/4 pattern on it. On pavements, you can see very common, the tiles that are used, which are an ancient, I think, Roman design tiles, which is now common. So you do see them now, but traditionally it wasn't used.
Thank you so much.
And just one question, that in the continuation, what you have discussing, is it that is a particular culture, is it from their surrounding or some nature resources? It is,
Yes and no. I mean, you can see bilateral symmetry or mirror symmetry quite common in nature, but you know, certain other symmetries are not. So 120-degree rotation. I mean, if you take a flower petal, for example, it can have 4-fold, 6-fold rotation, or even 120-degree rotation. I think one of the earlier examples that I had pictures had it, but it's a question of what you choose to accept and reject, and that's where your agency comes in. It's a question of that. It's a question of rejecting certain influences and accepting certain influences.
thanks. There's one hand raised by Indulekha. Please, can you go ahead?
Yeah, it's a connected question, Professor Khasi. You were talking about materials also, fabric. So there are these weaves. So you
Sorry,
have a huge weave. You talked about basket weaving also.
Right.
There are these weaves for material, cloth also. So India has a huge range of it, but let us focus on this small thing about Scotland. They have these tweeds, which differs from clan to clan. Within Scotland itself, they identify their clans by the weave of the particular cloth.
Yes, that's a very good example.
So, does it come under any branch of mathematics? Different modes of weaving?
If there is a pattern on the weave itself, it can be classified. I mean, there are like for example, I mentioned the Native American baskets. They have patterns on them, depending on how they weave it. It could be a border type of pattern, or it could be a plain pattern. So as long as you can identify sort of a repeated periodic pattern on it, then yes, it can be classified.
I was thinking more in the sense of you have lines running horizontally and let's say lines running vertically, and then what should I call it, weave them.
The warp and the
besides that, a pattern comes out where it doesn't fall apart. It has to stay together.
This is restricted to what I said earlier, periodic patterns on the plane. And the plane, it doesn't have to be a plane, it can be a rounded basket shape, but it has to be periodic. So the, what are known as arabesque patterns don't qualify, for example, because they're not periodic. If you draw like a floral pattern that doesn't repeat, it doesn't qualify. You can add color, like there's another, it takes you to another level of complexity in terms of how many possible groups are there. So instead of 17, you have something like 63 or something. But it is restricted to periodic patterns. So if the patterns are not periodic, then this particular analysis doesn't apply.
Okay, thank you very much. It is a beautiful talk.
Thank you.
Fozia, this is Suri here. I was wondering whether you also look at three-dimensional space groups and so on anytime with respect to
I haven't done that yet. As I said, I've restricted the color also, but one can. there are 230, I think, options. So that makes it a little more complex, but it is definitely open to study. And if we're going through this NAC thing right now, if it lets me breathe, I may actually focus on that also.
Right. I mean, especially vis-a-vis culture, I mean.
Huh?
Especially vis-a-vis the cultures of the different regions and what kind of space
Right.
groups limit. Thank you. Nice lecture. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Any other question from the audience?